All right. This week's topic is aggression. So when we talk about aggression, psychologists have very specific definitions when it comes to aggression. So aggression is any behavior that's intended to harm another living being who is motivated to avoid this harm. This is sort of a mouthful, but has a lot of important pieces to it. So any behavior, right, this implies that it has to be something that you do. Thinking about murdering someone does not count as aggression. It's the actual act that is aggressive. Intention implies that you meant to do something, right? There's some goal-directed behavior here. You are trying to do something. We'll talk about intention here in a minute. And then harm, this can be both physical and psychological. So we're not limited to specifically physical harm. And then another living being, right? This assumes that the target of the act is alive, and it also assumes that the target does not want to experience that harm in order for it to be officially classified as aggression. So for example, going to the dentist. When you go to the dentist because you have a really bad cavity and the dentist drills your teeth, this is a behavior that is intended and it does produce physical harm. But you as a human being are not motivated to avoid that harm. You are presumably in more pain from the cavity, and you know that the pain that's temporary that the dentist is causing you is ultimately going to heal your tooth or help you to experience less pain. So even though it's harm and it's intended harm, you're not motivated to avoid that harm, therefore it doesn't count as aggression. Now aggression, it does not matter whether or not the act is justified, right? That does not define aggression. Whether it's for the greater good or something like that does not define aggression, right? It's more about harm and intention. And we know harm is pretty straightforward, physical harm, psychological harm, but how do we know about people's intentions? When we talk about intention, we're talking about when someone is trying to do something. In order to qualify as having intention, you have to desire some particular outcome. You have to think about and foresee the effects of this outcome, right? So you have to think about it in advance. You have to make a decision to act, and you actually have to physically be able to perform the behavior and be aware that you are actually acting, right? All of these things go together in order to say that a person intended to do something, right? So you can think about this in terms of the criminal justice system. The highest classification of murder, the highest charge or the most serious charge of murder is premeditated murder, which implies that you desired to kill someone, you thought about it in advance, you knew what you were doing, and you did it. Right? That's intentional murder. We can contrast this to manslaughter, right? You were on your way home, you were texting and driving, and you accidentally hit a pedestrian, right? You did not intend to hit that pedestrian. You did not desire that outcome. And even though maybe you knew that you were risking that outcome because of texting while driving, right, that wasn't your intention. And so we have lesser penalties for people who commit unintended acts of aggression. Now we can break down aggression into a couple different forms. We can talk about hostile versus instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression is aggression that is just sort of a means to an end. So you can think about this in terms of sort of the football analogy. Football is an inherently aggressive sport. You know, these large gentlemen are sort of beating each other up on the field. But the only reason that they're doing that is because they want to win the game, and aggression is the means that allows them to win the game. You can contrast this with hostile aggression, where for hostile aggression, the aggression itself is done for its own sake, right? The purpose or the goal of the aggressive behavior is just the aggressive behavior. There isn't some larger goal that the aggression is intended to help achieve, the way it is with football. So for example, here, back in the early 2000s, then President Bush visited Iraq, and this Iraqi reporter threw a shoe at the president. And if you've seen this video, the president actually sort of very deftly sort of ducks out of the way. But this is hostile aggression, right? Behavior that's intended to harm, and the person is motivated to avoid that harm. But the reason why this person did this was specifically to harm the president, right? It wasn't some sort of larger motivation or because the president was in his way, right? It's just this very sort of angry, hostile aggression. We can also contrast this into direct versus indirect. So direct aggression we're sort of aware of. This is overt displays of aggression. You can think of hitting, yelling, insulting someone. These kinds of things are direct aggression. Indirect aggression is less obvious, right? So this is, you can think of this almost like people will say passive aggression or spreading rumors. Also leaving booby traps, right? Landmines are a form of indirect aggression. You can think of, Indiana Jones for this example, right? It's a behavior that's intended to harm another person, but you are not physically there when it happens, right? You are not pulling that trigger to send that giant boulder rolling down after Indiana Jones, right? So these are forms of indirect aggression. And you can put this all together. So punching someone so that you can rob their house would count as sort of direct instrumental aggression. It's direct because you're physically hurting someone. You're right there pulling the trigger. And it's instrumental because you didn't run in there specifically to beat this person up. You're just beating them up because they are in your way as you are trying to rob their house. Okay, that would be instrumental. The goal is to rob the house, not to necessarily hurt someone. Indirect aggression would be spreading rumors about a running mate in an election. So this is instrumental because you don't really care about who this person is. You just care about winning the election. And it's indirect because you are, it's actually these days is probably your political action committee is running ads that have falsehoods in them to try and help you to win the election. So hostile direct aggression, again, it's hostile because you are intending to harm someone and your goal is actually to harm someone. That's your only goal. It's not in service of some larger goal you have. So punching your romantic partner for infidelity would be a direct hostile act. And then indirect hostile act would be keying your romantic partner's car for infidelity, right? It's a hostile act. But it's indirect. You're not directly harming them. They're not there when the aggression is happening. Typically, there are gender differences in these types of aggression. So women and men use aggression differently. Men tend to use more direct aggression. Women tend to use more indirect aggression. But both men and women use equal amounts of hostile and instrumental aggression. And part of these gender differences may have to do with men and women's different physiological abilities. So men, on average, tend to be larger and stronger than women, which may make them more confident in direct hostile or direct aggression. I imagine that if one were to take a subsample of women who were, exceptionally strong or equally as strong as men, we might see this gender difference sort of go away. Now, there are some different kinds of causes of aggression. The primary cause that we talk about is frustration. Frustration, we experience frustration all the time. And the way to think about frustration is just interference with some kind of goal. If you have a goal and something is interfering with your ability to achieve that goal, then you experience frustration. So, for example, traffic is sort of the most classic and most frustrating experiences, especially living here in the city of Chicago. The goal that you have is to get home. And the traffic is interfering with your goal. It's interfering with your ability to get home. And this leads you to experience frustration. And frustration can lead to aggression. Now, originally, Dollard and the colleagues back in the 1930s, they said that frustration always leads to aggression, and aggression is always caused by frustration. And this is a very slight overestimation. So Berkowitz came along and said it's not frustration per se, but it's just sort of the negative affect that leads to aggression. Frustration is just one form of negative affect, but you can be in a bad mood, you can be annoyed, angry, distraught, or indignant, and all of these things increase the likelihood of aggression. People believe that lashing out is going to make them feel better, but as we'll see in a little bit, that that's not necessarily the case. So we know that negative affect is associated with aggression, and one of the reasons for this is the physiological component of that emotional experience. So whether you are having the happiest day of your life or the worst day of your life, the physiological component of that emotional experience is the same. In other words, we only have one sort of state of physiological arousal, and we apply different sort of connotations to that arousal. So if you're very excited as you're opening up your birthday present, right, the reason why you interpret that physical component as excitement is because of the context. Okay. So the physiological and affective states are similar across a range of emotions that we experience. So Zoman and Ketcher did a really cool study with aggression. And what they did was they had people come into the lab and they had them sit on an exercise bike. And half of them exercised. The other half of them did not exercise. Okay. And then what they did was they had a Confederate come in and provoke them. So typically how we do this is we have, so we have these people, half of them rode the bike for 20 minutes, the other half didn't. And then we say, okay, write a quick essay about, some topic that's important to you. And then we're going to have the person in the next room evaluate it. And the person in the next room just says terrible things about your essay, about, how terrible of a writer you are, and they provoke you in some way. And then what we do is we give the participant the opportunity to aggress against the person who provoked them. In this study, it was by shocking them. Again, 1970s, we're all excited about shocking people. So the participants were given the opportunity to shock the person who had just provoked them. So clearly we have this main effect here of provocation. So if you're provoked, you're more likely to aggress compared to if you're not provoked. But we have this interesting interaction pattern here with the exercise condition, whereby if you're in the provoked condition and you've exercised, you actually are significantly more aggressive than the people in the provoked condition who did not exercise, right? Which suggests that that physiological arousal that you experience as part of exercise is translating into more aggression when you are put into this bad mood, right? Suggesting that this physiological component plays a huge role in aggressive behavior. Now, there are other sources of aggression as well, or source causes of aggression as well. So you can think of cognitive biases. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about intention is that the intentions of other people sort of exist in their own heads, right? And we have to sort of use all the information we have available to get at what a person's intention might be in a particular situation. And we are not always very good at this. We have many experiences where someone does something that we don't really know why they did what they did. And we talk about this as an ambiguous provocation, right? So for example, the policeman pushes someone out of the way. Well, that's ambiguous, right? Maybe the policeman is saving them. Maybe the policeman is knocking them to the ground. The man starts screaming when the athlete runs by, right? Maybe the person is cheering for the person who's running by, or maybe they're insulting them, right? We talk about this in terms of the hostile attribution bias, right? So some people tend to perceive the ambiguous actions of others as having aggressive intent, just sort of habitually. In any instance where there's an ambiguous provocation, where someone does something that harms you in some way and you're not entirely sure why they did what they did, some people tend to, in that situation, interpret that behavior as hostile. This is a classic study. So this is Dodge 1980. They divided children up into aggressive and non-aggressive groups. And interestingly, they do this based on peer evaluations. So they go into the classroom and they say, tell me the top 3 kids in your class who are the most aggressive. And they ask all the kids, and invariably the 3 most aggressive kids sort of bubble up to the top of the list across all of the children's lists. So they divide these kids up into aggressive and non-aggressive groups. And then they bring them into their lab, And they create this provocation scenario. So what they do is they bring him into the lab and they sit him down at a table and they say, all right, little Billy, today we're going to be working on this puzzle. And the puzzle is sort of this physical thing. You can think about it as sort of like building Legos. You're putting this puzzle together. And about halfway through, they say, you know what, little Billy, I want to take your puzzle into the other room. There's another boy in this other room who's also working on a puzzle. And I just want to show him your puzzle. And so he takes the Billy's little puzzle he's been working on so hard into the other room, and he takes it into the other room, and little Billy hears in the other room one of three possible things. So he hears the puzzle break completely. So you hear the puzzle shatter to the floor, and he hears either that the boy in the other room says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I accidentally broke the puzzle." Right? That'd be the accident condition. Or he hears the little boy in the other room say, "Oh my gosh, this kid's doing way better than me. I'm going to destroy his puzzle." Right? So this would be intentional, like clearly intentional. Or, and the most interesting one, it's ambiguous. So little Billy hears his puzzle get destroyed in the next room, but there's nothing else to go with that. He doesn't know why it happened. Now, what they found was that when they asked them why they thought the other kid destroyed their puzzle, the people in the accidental condition clearly both identified that it was an accident. Even the aggressive kid said, well, he didn't mean to do that, it was an accident. The same thing was true in the intentional condition. They both clearly identified that behavior as intentional, right? He said, you're doing better than me, I'm going to destroy this puzzle, it's intentional. But what was most interesting was in the ambiguous condition, the non-aggressive kids leaned on that benign intent. Well, it was probably an accident. But the aggressive kids lean on a hostile explanation. Well, they probably did it on purpose. And so what this suggests is that children who are chronically aggressive are more likely to see hostile intent. They're more likely to see the world as a hostile place. And what we find is that if you make hostile attributions, right, if you assume or you conclude that other people have hostile intentions, even though the situation's ambiguous, even though you can't really know what their intentions are, if you make that assumption, then you are more likely to react aggressively. And this is true for both children and adults. There are other causes of aggression. So cultures of honor is one big cause. Cultures of honor is a theory that suggests that there are certain cultures in the United States that place a very high value on dignified and respectful treatment. And going along with that, any threat to one's sense of dignity or respect is to be met with an aggressive response. In other words, that aggression is a completely justifiable way to defend one's sense of honor. And there is a strong culture of honor in the American South. And what Nisbet and his colleagues found initially was that there was this relationship between herding and farming and aggressive behavior. What they found was that the murder rates were much higher among herding communities as opposed to farming communities. So again, think about herding and farming. Herding communities, these are like this cattle rustler right here. These are, shepherds, people who tend to flocks of animals. Farming is sort of people who have tracts of land and they're farming food. Now, what's interesting about this is that what we find in a recent study is that social status actually significantly mediates a relationship between agrarian practice and murder rates. So what's really going on here is that cultures of honor tend to develop in relatively low social status communities. So in the American South, the people who are farmers typically own land, and they are typically higher socioeconomic status than those who are in the herding communities. And so what this suggests is that cultures of honor are especially likely to develop among relatively low socioeconomic status groups. Stereotypes also play a role in aggressive behavior. So for example, and this is especially true in ambiguous provocations. So for example, in 1999, Armando Diallo was shot and killed by police as he pulled the wallet out of his pocket. are probably familiar with this story. I believe it was also mentioned in the prejudice paper that we read. And this comes from this idea that the stereotype that African Americans are somehow dangerous or aggressive or more aggressive than other groups. Okay. And so there's a classic study that was interested in looking at whether or not prejudice plays a role in this kind of scenario. So this is, again, similar to the paper that you guys read for paper number 1, but it extends it a little bit more. So we look at, gun versus no gun, so whether or not the person in the picture is holding a gun versus no gun, whether the African American was, whether the target was white or African American, and then reaction time, how fast they were able to make a decision between shoot or no shoot. And what they found was that these are undergraduates, not police officers, just undergraduates are faster to shoot an African American who was armed and faster to not shoot an unarmed person who was white. And essentially what they found was that the participants required less certainty before shooting this African American target. So they extended this study by adding in stereotype information. And in this fictitious newspaper article, they read, so participants, before they participated in the study, before they did the shoot or no shoot task, they read a fictitious newspaper article that describes a series of armed robberies that were conducted by either a pair of black suspects or a pair of white suspects. And what they found was that when participants read about the pair of black suspects, their decision to shoot or not shoot was actually decreased. In other words, they required even less certainty before shooting an African American. But that did not occur for the white suspects, which suggests that in that instance, this activation of stereotype knowledge actually had a very strong effect on their decision to shoot or not shoot these African American subjects. Again, suggesting that stereotypes and prejudice do play a role in this aggression, especially things that we sort of see, especially recently in the news media. There are other sources of aggression, biological aggression. We can talk about evolution. So, for example, aggressive behavior is potentially adaptive behavior. So if you are, think about our evolutionary history, if you are aggressive in your acquisition of resources and defending territory, this might enhance your survival, might enhance your group survival and your genetic success, which is just passing on your genes to the next generation. And aggression may be one way to achieve and maintain status within a group, but aggressive behavior also puts you at greater risk for injury, right? So again, thinking about our evolutionary past, where, getting an infection in your arm from a cut might kill you because there are no antibiotics and there are no hospitals. So aggression is sort of perilous, right? On the one hand, it might lead you to attain status, but on the other hand, it's antithetical to survival because it increases the likelihood of injury. Now, evolutionary theorists will talk about men aggressing for resources, women aggressing to protect offspring. The argument here is females are limited in the number of children that they can have, whereas men can sort of spread their seed all over the planet. And, they also make the argument that females are going to be selective in their partners, so men have to compete for women through demonstrations of strength, etc. Evolutionary psychology is very controversial, and you need to sort of think critically about some of the claims of evolutionary psychologists. Much of evolutionary theory is sort of akin to, much evolutionary psychology is akin to sort of reverse engineering, right? So we're taking the current behaviors that we see in the population, and we're trying to work backwards to figure out how those behaviors might have evolved. And that's useful, except that oftentimes this kind of approach fails to take into consideration the evolutionary pressures of the time as opposed to the evolutionary pressures that we experience today. Testosterone also influences aggression. So one thing that we find is that testosterone is found in varying levels in both men and women. Men have more than women, but women also have testosterone. And increases in testosterone will lead to more aggression for both men and women. And this can even happen subconsciously. So in this study, what they did was they gave people either testosterone or a placebo, and then they showed them pictures of faces. And the faces were adjusted to be slightly angry or slightly happy or neutral. And what they found was that for those who were given testosterone, they actually stared down the faces of the angry faces a little bit longer than the happy faces and neutral faces, suggesting that the testosterone might have influenced their aggressive leanings subconsciously. They weren't aware that they were even doing this. What's also interesting about testosterone is that successful aggression leads to a boost in testosterone, right? So if you are, if you are on a football team and you are struggling and struggling and struggling, and then you score a touchdown, right? That success is going to lead to more testosterone. If you get into a fist fight and you win, at the end of that fist fight, your testosterone levels will go up. Okay. Conversely, if you lose that fist fight, your testosterone will go down. Right? And this is also true for competition. Now, there's sort of another side of this coin, though. Men who have sort of chronically high testosterone typically report lower quality of life and have a more pessimistic outlook on the future, right? So these gentlemen typically tend to be more angry, hostile. They tend to be more aggressive overall. Those with less testosterone tend to get a little bit more emotional support from others. They have better social networks and relationship. And actually, when we look into the data, men with high testosterone are more likely to get divorced as well. So people with super high testosterone may have poor social relationships because they tend to be more aggressive in their dealings with other people. Serotonin also influences aggression, but sort of in a roundabout way. Serotonin is one of these sort of feel-good chemicals, neurotransmitters that's involved in mood regulation. And it also helps with impulse control. And what we find is that people with low levels of serotonin are more aggressive, more likely to be aggressive. And this may be due to a decreased ability to control impulses. One thing that we find is that people who go on drugs that boost serotonin can actually reduce the amount of aggressive behavior that we see. Now, can't talk about aggression without talking about Freud. Freud had this a bunch of ideas, some of which are very interesting and some of which are completely bogus. So the aggression one falls into the bogus category. But he believed that people had these sort of unconscious drives and instincts. And one of the instincts that we had was the destructive death instinct. And this led us to be aggressive. And this, no one takes this very seriously today. But this led to what we call the catharsis hypothesis. And the catharsis hypothesis is that negative energy builds up inside of us and it needs to be released. So this can also be talked about as sort of venting aggression, venting behavior. So you can release this directly by punching a punching bag or punching a wall or going for a run or something like that. And it can be released vicariously by watching an aggressive show or a sporting event. If you're familiar with the Netflix series House of Cards, one of the main characters in that show likes to play Call of Duty when he's had a particularly rough day as a way of, Call of Duty is a violent video game, as a way of releasing aggression. Generally speaking, the catharsis hypothesis is false. So experiencing more aggression, venting aggression, observing aggression on TV does not actually decrease your aggressive behavior. It actually just maintains your state of physiological arousal and primes aggression and demonstrates that aggression is rewarded. right? And typically at this point in the class, some students will raise their hand and say, but, when I punch a wall, I feel much better afterwards, and I feel like my anger has gone away, has gone down. And I will say, yeah, well, this is true. You may feel better if you go for a run. You may feel better if you punch the wall, but you're maintaining that state of physiological arousal. And so temporarily, while you may feel better, because you are still in that state of physiological arousal, something else is going to be more likely to set you off in the future, right? The trick for reducing aggressive behavior and reducing aggressive impulses is to relax, right? And we'll talk about this in a little bit. The trick is to reduce that physiological arousal. So another interesting aspect of aggression are these situational cues. So you recall automatic processes we talked about, and the Stroop effect, for example. It is more difficult to say the color of the word when it is conflicted with what the word says, because reading is relatively automatic, and so that interferes with your ability. We also talked about categorizing people and those sorts of things. One thing that we know is that violent aggressive cues can activate related knowledge structures automatically in our brain. That is to say, when you see something that is associated with aggression, it activates in your brain all of the knowledge structures, all of the things that are associated with aggression. So there's a classic study called that looks at what we call the weapons effect. You can think of this similar to the exercise study. So someone comes in, they're provoked by a Confederate, insulting the essay that they wrote, and then they're given the option to be aggressive towards the Confederates. And what they found, what they did in this study is that they randomly assigned participants to have this experience in the presence of sports equipment or a weapon. Right? So imagine you come into the study and like on one end of the table down there, there's like a badminton set, which is, if you're not familiar with badminton, it's kind of like tennis, but it's just sports equipment, which would theoretically prime knowledge structures related to competition. Whereas in the other condition, there were weapons on the other end of the table. So again, you come in, you sit down, you're doing the study, and there's just two guns just hanging out down on the other end of the table, just nonchalantly. And what they found was that participants who experienced the provocation in the presence of the weapon were more aggressive towards the Confederate. They shocked them more than participants who experienced that provocation in the presence of the sports equipment, which suggests that the weapons actually primed or activated knowledge structures in the participants' brains associated with aggression and aggressive behavior. What's interesting about this is that remember that knowledge structures are developed over the course of your life. That is to say that what is activated in your brain when you see a weapon depends on your history and your experience with weapons. They did a different version of this study where they brought hunters in to do the study. And the hunters did not show this increased aggressive behavior in the presence of the gun. And this is presumably because hunters have different associations with weapons than the general public. Our general public sees weapons in terms of aggression towards other people, whereas hunters might see weapons in terms of hunting and sort of getting food to feed their family. So what's interesting about this, so as you take this a step further, is that any object that is associated with aggression or pain or unpleasantness might serve as an aggression-enhancing situational cue, right? So if, to use sort of a unpleasant example, if, while you were growing up, you were punished by being spanked with a belt, right? Then belts for you might actually activate knowledge structures related to aggression. One other aspect about these situational sources of aggression has to do with controlled processes. One thing to be aware of is that there's always an element of choice in how we respond to situations. We may have the belief that aggression is an appropriate way to handle conflict or achieve someone's ends. And you might believe that you can successfully carry out that aggressive response. But what we find is that people who have increased self-control leads to decreased aggression. That is to say that people with high self-control are able to make the decision to not respond aggressively in provocation situations. And this sort of highlights this idea that people experience frustration and negative affect all the time, but most people are not aggressive. We've also talked about cognitive biases. We talked about the hostile attribution bias, but there's also a second version of this called the hostile expectation bias. So hostile attribution is perceiving the ambiguous actions of others as being aggressive. Hostile expectation is the tendency to assume that people will react to conflict with aggression, right? Your assumption that other people are going to behave aggressively towards you if there's a conflict. And this increases your vigilance to threats. It makes you highly aware of potential threats in your environment. Bandura, Albert Bandura is a famous social psychologist, does a lot of work on what we call social learning theory. And social learning theory basically states that much of what we learn through direct observation of other people. For example, we know that children who experience domestic abuse, children who are victims of domestic violence, are more likely to be aggressive in the future, right? We know that abusers, people who have been abused, are significantly more likely to grow up to be abusers. And one can argue that in that process of experiencing abuse, children are learning that aggression is the way to accomplish tasks. Right? Aggression is an appropriate means to achieve whatever end it is that you have, whether that is, whether that is some kind of instrumental end or some kind of hostile end. So go ahead and click out of this lecture and click on the link on Moodle and watch the short video about social learning theory. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've gone and watched the video. One interesting thing that we saw in that video was that the children were modeling the aggressive behavior of the adults. That is to say that when the children were allowed to watch the adults behave aggressively towards these objects, towards this inflatable clown doll, that the children themselves also displayed that behavior. And towards the end of that video, Bandura highlights why this is such an important aspect of how aggression is learned, because aggression is pervasive, especially in the United States. So, for example, some estimates suggest that the average child sees 8,000 murders on television and over 100,000 acts of violence before they finish elementary school. Right? So think about that. Your average 13 to 14-year-old has seen 8,000 murders on television and in movies. We also live in a culture that promotes violence, right? So we see, it's football season. People get very excited about football and the aggression that's shown in football. People play violent video games and people watch violent television. There is a strong relationship between consuming violent media and aggressive behavior. There is a tremendous amount of research that looks at the causal effect of consuming violent media on aggressive behavior. And there's overwhelming evidence to suggest that, yes, consuming violent media leads to increased aggressive behavior. So, for example, Huseman and colleagues in 2003 looked at the longitudinal relations between TV violence viewing and aggressive behavior over 15 years. So what they did was they got a group of kids who were about 6 to 10 years old and then followed them for 15 years. And they measured their level of violent media consumption initially, and then they looked at some key indicators later on in life. Now, violent media consumption back in the 1970s when they started the study has to do with watching violent TV shows. So you can think of these things like Starsky and Hutch, or these sort of old school cop drama TV violence. Arguably much less violent and aggressive than the television that we have today. What they found was that exposure to media violence as a child predicted future aggression. So they broke them up into males and females, and we looked at the amount of aggression that they experienced as adults. This was partly based on self-report, how often do you get into fights and that kind of thing, but it was also based on things like police records and arrest records and these kinds of things. And what they found was that for people who were low in TV watching, but TV violence, that they did not have a high degree of aggression as adults. But for people who are high in TV watching violence, they had a significantly higher level of aggression as adults compared to those who are low or moderate. And what's interesting about this, we saw the same pattern for women, right? So women who are high, females who are high in consuming violent media when they were kids exhibited greater aggression compared to women who experienced who watched low levels or moderate levels of TV violence. So this supports this idea that exposure to media violence does predict future aggression. But it is not always going to be causal, right? One thing that we say about human behavior is that it is overdetermined. And so when I say that human behavior is overdetermined, what that means is that in any given moment of the day, any given decision that you make, experience that you have, there are 1,000,001 different influences on you at that particular moment, right? How hungry are you? How much sleep did you get last night? How was your train ride in? What interactions did you have with family members? How are things going with you at school and at work? All of those things go into any given decision that you make in any given moment, right? So it's overdetermined. It's determined by many, 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 many things, right? And so while we can show in the lab that there is a causal effect of media consumption and aggression, right? It's not necessarily causal in life, right? So for example, typically some student raises their hand at this point and said, well, I've played lots of Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto and all kinds of violent video games, and I'm not aggressive. I've never been arrested. I've never been in fistfights. And this is actually true of me, your professor. When I was younger, I played a lot of these video games. And the last time I was in physical altercation with someone was when I was in 3rd grade. But the idea here is that increased consumption of media violence is a risk factor. It is one of those things where in that very moment where you are trying to make the decision to, fight or not fight someone, exposure to media violence might be that one thing that pushes you over the edge. Where if you had not been exposed to that media violence, you might have made the decision to not get into that fight or to not behave aggressively towards this other person. So you can think about this as sort of a risk factor. All right, so that's it for this week. Make sure you look at the discussion and the quiz. Also, don't forget this week I'm introducing a new paper. So we'll have an article to read, and you'll have a paper to write about that article. And so make sure you check out the paper number 2 video as well.